So what I'll do then is just actually provide a rationale for this project, explain a little bit of background of the project, before then handing over to the others on this project team who are going to talk about specific different parts of the project that we're doing. Okay, so basically this is an ERC starting grant that started in 2018 and is running for 5 years. And I'll be very brief sort of to explain the rationale behind it, but it builds on the idea that we are increasingly turning to data systems across social life, something that we are obviously very familiar with in this community, but also that it has significant implications for how we're able to participate in society in different ways, how we're able to influence decisions that come to govern our lives, how we're able to position ourselves in society. And the rationale behind this started previously, prior to this, quite a couple of years back in sort of 2014 already, when I was looking at work around digital surveillance programs in particular, and looking at sort of the framing around that in terms of understanding what's at stake with the increasing use of data across these different areas of our social life. Of course, at that point I was looking specifically at the Snowden leaks, which was confined to sort of intelligence services and security, but this logic of understanding people through data and making and sorting populations and categorizing people through data is a phenomenon that obviously extends far beyond that. But at the time, the issue was often framed as one of surveillance and privacy. So the reason for doing this project around data justice was, in first instance, to sort of recognize a need to reframe what is actually at stake and to sort of push this towards a more explicit engagement with questions of power, to situate this in sort of historical conditions, and to use a much broader social justice frame, really, that considers questions beyond surveillance and privacy, but situates this also in relation to social and economic inequality and questions of justice, broadly speaking. So that's kind of where the sort of data justice frame really comes from. But also at the sort of a need to make sure that we understand that these developments are happening in particular context. And so at the time there had been a lot of discussion around data that was very abstract and talked about the sort of logics around datafication in a kind of very abstract and siloed way that focused a lot on the technologies themselves. And also, I think that continues often in our discussion of data justice, the issues often on the data system itself and the algorithms and how they might be biased, etc. But actually, instead of doing that, using a much more sort of grounded and situated approach that looks at how data practices and what's happening with data relates to other existing social practices and is contingent upon a wider political economy, if you like, and broader historical trends and developments, particularly in these kinds of contentious spaces where our ability to participate in society is at stake. So it was about sort of reframing the approach as well to ground these systems in actual case studies, existing social practices, also taking much more account of people's experiences of engaging with these kinds of systems, something that is also, I think, we're still struggling with in terms of bringing to light. How are people actually experiencing these developments, those who are particularly impacted by this, and also the need for a sort of interdisciplinary approach. And then importantly also the rationale behind this project was also to, in some ways, try and find out a lot of our discussions around what's at stake and the implications of these developments, I think, has been very informed by US-centered discussions around notions also of social justice in that regard. But actually changing the focus a bit to understand we're focusing on Europe in this project, so how are these developments playing out within a European context as well? But we might also have a different understanding of social and economic rights and so forth. So that's kind of the reason for doing this. So what we are looking at are trying to understand how education impacts on particular communities. We're interested in those who are most impacted, if you like, and then how social and economic rights might apply to these different contexts, or what are the implications for social and economic rights, and how might we think about data justice and ways of responding to some of the challenges that we are seeing. And the kind of areas that we're looking at that we'll hear from now in the next 3 presentations is looking at this in terms of border control and migration, law enforcement and policing, and low-wage work. And the reason for looking at these different sites is because, in part, because that's where a lot of experimentation around the use of data systems is carried out, but also because it sort of implicates communities and groups who have been historically oppressed and marginalized in our society. And so it's also to understand what are the implications within those types of frameworks, or those types of contexts. And so that's kind of why we're looking at it in this respect. And we're thinking about low-wage work outside of the gig economy, I should say, because a lot of focus has been on the gig economy, but actually looking at what's happening in standard employment, which impacts much more people. How we are doing this, just to say, so to kind of mention, we are taking a sort of case study approach and are trying to, I guess, circle around these different areas and sites of study by identifying the types of companies, the nature of the software, the types of data that are being used in the different areas we're looking at, the different sort of empirical sites we are looking at, but linking that or situating that within institutional practices and asking practitioners how they're using these different data systems, for what purpose, what are the challenges, how are these negotiated, and then linking that then also to how this is changing people's experiences within the different contexts we're looking at. So linking that then to impact of communities, understanding experiences, and then from that trying to engage with some of the policy implications, particularly thinking beyond questions of data protection to thinking about data rights, I guess, in relation to sort of social and economic rights that are particularly pertinent to the empirical sites that we are studying. So labor law, anti-discrimination, protection of vulnerable communities, those types of frameworks that we actually have in various different formats in Europe that might be implicated in this. And so just briefly to sort of say, we're sort of thinking through what does this mean then for when talking about data justice. And these are preliminary talks. This is datafication, and this is beyond, and that says from. Just to get that. But so it's initially just to sort of think about how this use of this data in these different areas disrupts sort of established paradigms of justice, and this is something that Nancy Fraser has talked about in terms of abnormal justice, where our discussions around what constitutes, what the nature of our justice claims might be, who is, what the scope of justice is, so who is impacted by it, and also what the procedure for upholding justice claim or pursuing justice claims, all of these different established paradigms are all being disrupted with the turn to data in these different areas. And that means that we have to look at the conditions under which we come to understand justice, not just understanding justice as the distribution of goods, but moving beyond this kind of distributive paradigm, as Iris Marion Young calls it, to look at actual conditions, historical conditions of domination and oppression, to understand the abilities that people have to make justice claims. And that means actually also identifying or grounding our study of this rather than identifying sort of universal principles of justice necessarily, or identifying some ideal notion of what data justice would be, actually trying to identify where do claims of injustice come from, which may or may not concern data, but actually data has a role to play in the claims of injustice that emerge, right? So it's actually decentering data and technology in our understanding of data justice that we're trying to do with this. So that's where I'll end, and then I'll hand over to Fieke Jansen as our first presentation of some of the field work that we've been doing for the past, I guess, year or so with this project.